let's get going for real. All right, so you all, thanks for joining us. We got a bunch of folks on line now with us. I want to thank my staff, the staff of Policy Matters, who you're going to hear from today, the folks you're not going to see but do this work every day. They're the real experts here. I want to say a big thank you to Kalitha, who is keeping this boat afloat this morning, making sure all of the slides run and we keep things moving along. You'll also hear from Kalitha later in the conversation, so you'll get to meet her too. And a big thank you to all of you spending a little time getting to know us this morning, getting to know our work. We really do appreciate it. And we hope that you find this meaningful and that it is this opportunity for you to get a better sense of who we are, what we do, how to find us. And we can really be that resource to you now as a candidate and then later as elected officials. So housekeeping, we already talked about the chat function. That is at the bottom of your screen. Drop that in there. All of the panelists will see it. Keep questions flowing during the talk. We're running this like a webinar, so it's a little bit of a lecture style. So using that chat function helps us see where you're at, see how things are going on your end, okay? So just drop it in there. We are going to record the presentation portion of the conversation today. So you'll see that recording light in the top of your screen. When we get to the Q&A portion, we will stop recording so people can feel comfortable sharing their questions. We don't want people to think that there's a good question or a bad question or a question they're afraid to ask. There's no such thing. There's only questions. So we hope that will encourage folks to communicate with us and share where they're at. So who are we? Who are these people you're listening to this morning? So Policy Matters, many of you know us, and for those that don't or don't know us that well, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization. And, you know, we really do believe that state policy can and should make Ohio a more vibrant, equitable, sustainable, inclusive place. That no matter if you're Black, white, if you're in Lucasville or Lorain, you have a different belief, you have a different identity, that Ohio needs to be a place where all people, everyone, can build a life for themselves. And we think there's a role for state policy to get us there. So that's what we believe. We believe in values-driven policy analysis, unassailable research, strategic communications, and building coalitions and partnerships that make that policy a reality in Ohio. So we have big policy dreams here at Policy Matters Ohio, and there's lots of ways to connect with us. You're experiencing one of them through these kinds of briefings, webinars, Facebook Live events, where we try to have more interaction with folks. But there's also certainly social media. You see those links at the bottom of your screen. And then the most digestible way to get all of our information to kind of keep up with this is just joining our e-news. You'll get a newsletter full of the things that we put out, full of activity, you know, dates, important things to keep in mind, ways to participate, things to put on your calendar to join us in. So that's a really solid way to stay up to date on everything coming out of our shop. Next slide, please, Kalitha. All right, so here you're going to hear from a lot of folks today in our organization, a lot of policy experts, but there's even more people here at Policy Matters Ohio. This is all of our folks that you will be missing out from. You can see that we cover, in addition to the stuff you're going to hear about, health and human services work, we have engagement and outreach component in our shop that's focusing a lot on census and voting. And we even have Gizmo, the office dog, he's only here for the treats and the head pats, but we love him anyway. So these are our folks. Now you will see faces and names for all of us, so you are no longer a stranger, and you know that you can reach out and connect with any one of us should you need to. Next slide, please, Kalitha. All right. So here's where we're headed today, and we're going to cover a lot of information. So you're going to get a sampling, a taste of all of the kinds of things that we do and work on here at Policy Matters, connect some names to faces, faces to work areas, so that we hope you'll connect with us whenever you have additional questions about these areas of work, or you want to just explore a brief that comes out, right? You'll know who we are. And so because we're trying to cover a lot of ground, we're just going to pass the baton through this presentation, right? So if you're a person who needs a little of the direction setting or roadmap to stay on track and kind of not get lost through the conversation, here's that roadmap for you and what we plan on covering today. All right, so next slide. All right, so let's get going. Let me pass the baton here. So you're going to hear from our researcher in Cleveland, Mike Shields, starting off with an overview of the Ohio economy. I know that it's hard to even conceptualize where we are in the economic space at this point, but Mike's going to walk us through that so we get a better understanding of the kind of urgency, the scope of the crisis that we're in. So Mike, you want to take it away?
Thanks, Hannah. Hi, everybody. We can go to next slide, please. Thank you. So we're in the deepest recession of most of our lives. The policy recommendations that you hear today are grounded in that new reality, and they're focused on getting all Ohioans through to the recovery. You can see from our figures here, economic activity in the second quarter fell 34%. That's for the United States. That's more than $2 trillion in economic activity gone. Here in Ohio, more than 1 million workers have filed jobless claims. 554,000 of them were still out of work as of June. Next slide, please. This chart shows you the most common jobs in Ohio as of 2019. These are the latest and best data, but COVID-19 has reshaped our economy so quickly and so profoundly that many of these jobs, many of the folks doing these jobs are no longer working there. A lot of these jobs don't exist any longer. But this chart still tells us a couple of things. One, that there's a tremendous number of our fellow Ohioans who've been working on the front lines to get us through the early part of the COVID-19 crisis, and that many of them were working without the safety protections that they needed. And another thing that it shows us is that many of these same Ohioans lacked adequate wages and stood on a really shaky foundation to face a recession to begin with. Wages in a lot of these jobs were so low that depending on the number of hours they worked, the person could be excluded from even receiving unemployment compensation if they were laid off, as happened with 300,000 Ohioans, both for that reason because of low wages and for many because they were misclassified or may have been independent business owners, a handful of them. All of these workers need adequate wages. We need to pass a robust minimum wage so that every Ohioan who works for a living is paid enough to cover the basics. Next slide, please. So Ohio workers are dealing with three basic realities today. There's a group of workers who are working on the front lines. They're at high risk of contracting COVID-19. These folks need clear, mandatory, and enforceable workplace safety guidelines. They need paid sick leave in the event that they do get sick. There are folks who are working from home. Second group. These folks aren't at heightened risk of getting COVID-19. They have a measure of protection from it, but they do face some specific work challenges. They may be taking on new child caregiving tasks because many of our child care centers are closed or at reduced capacity. Schools, as you know, closed this past spring, and there's uncertainty about opening. So folks juggling new tasks are faced with some challenges for their work. These folks are going to need access to safe and reliable childcare going forward. Right now, they may need to be able to take a step back from work. So one thing that we need to do is make sure that childcare and schooling are considered just cause if you're not able to return to work because of these reasons. And there's a large group of folks who are still unemployed. As we said, more than 500,000 folks are still dealing with this. We're going to dive into unemployment more deeply, but one thing that I will just flag is the policies that I've mentioned. We've got lots of research. In fact, we've got a report on each of these things on our website. I hope that you'll check it out. And always you can reach out to us for questions on these. So again, protecting workers on the job. We've got to make sure that people don't have to choose between their health and their livelihood. We need to implement mandatory workplace safety measures, and we've got to enforce them. We need to provide robust paid sick leave. We don't want workers showing up to work sick in a pandemic. And we don't want them having to choose between their work and their health. We need to require all employers to provide emergency paid sick leave now, and enable workers to earn paid sick leave going forward. And we need a living minimum wage. Ohio's minimum wage has actually fallen in value by 28% since its peak back in 1968. That means that today's Ohio workers live with less wage protections than their grandparents enjoyed. We've got to pass a living minimum wage for all Ohioans. So see our website, give us a call. Let's turn to unemployment. Next, please. So we field a lot of questions about how to get Ohioans back to work quickly. I think one thing we want to recognize is that some Ohioans won't be able to go back to work right away. So we've got to make sure that people don't have to choose between their health and their livelihood. A robust unemployment system is critical to that. And it also provides vital and targeted fiscal stimulus. That's a fancy way of saying it supports people's spending. If we provide that, along with supporting critical infrastructure like local governments, you'll hear more about that, we're going to support as many jobs as we can and return people to work much more quickly. So you can see some figures here. The $600 weekly supplement that the federal government pays has already directed $8 billion to more than 500,000 Ohio workers. This is directed spending exactly where it needs to go to folks who otherwise would be facing a crisis. And also, this benefits not just the folks who receive unemployment benefits, but also the businesses that they're supporting. So the economist Mark Zandi at Moody's found that every dollar spent on unemployment generates $1.61 in economic activities. So this is really a vital bit of infrastructure that we need, not just for those folks who are displaced from work, but to restore the vitality to our whole state economy. And one thing that Ohio, that unemployment does in Ohio and elsewhere, is to help people to transition to the right job as they're getting back into the workforce, and not just desperately, take whatever first job becomes available. One thing that I will flag, because I know that folks are going to be thinking about hard decisions with regard to the state budget, is that the unemployment comp system is separate from the state budget. It's an employer-funded system, and it's not a burdensome one. Employers pay about half a penny in premiums for each dollar that they spend on wages. Next slide, please. Okay, so what can Ohio do? One thing is that we need to fix administration. Now, it's true that the demands on the unemployment system are unprecedented today, but Ohio policymakers have failed to make UC a priority for a long time. And so they have starved ODJFS of resources that it really needed to respond to this crisis. Our filing system is 16 years old. Many of the poorest people in Ohio waited for more than a month to receive any unemployment benefits at all. When the state rejected these workers for regular claims, they didn't notify them that they could be eligible for pandemic unemployment assistance. That's the federal program. And they didn't hold on to their applications. Michigan held people's applications and transferred them into the new system as it was set up. Ohio made people reapply and didn't tell them how. So definitely some improvements that we need to make here. There is legislation pending that would do that. House Bill 614 would establish a committee to review this and to make recommendations. That's something that we need to do. We also need a few other things. We need strong federal support. We need to broaden eligibility, and we need stronger financing. Again, employers pay about half a penny on each dollar in wages. That's one reason that Ohio has one of the lowest recipiency rates in the nation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just a couple other things that are going on. With regard to Governor DeWine's return to work, he has allowed workers who are susceptible to COVID-19 to stay at home and to continue to receive their benefits. ODJFS has yet to clarify what's going to happen with parents whose kids are in school online, and so making sure that those folks have just cause if they're not able to get back to work right away is something that's really critical. We need to ensure access to benefits. So 270,000 claimants in the pandemic unemployment assistance who are not eligible for regular comp were flagged for fraud. That's an awful lot of people who were legitimate claimants who have now been waiting for more than 3 weeks to get their benefits. So this is something that we've got to resolve and quickly. And one thing, this is really low-hanging fruit. We can promote shared work. There are 46,000 workers at 909 and counting Ohio employers who are participating in shared work. This is a way that instead of laying off workers, under the program, employers can reduce the hours across the board, pro rata, for all of their workers or for a certain group of their workers. So that helps keep people attached to the workforce, attached to their specific employers, and it's going to help us to quickly recover from the recession once we can start to see more economic activity, because workers are still going to be on tap and connected with their employers. So I think the last word is that restoring the health of Ohio's economy really means keeping the people who live here safe and healthy. With that, I want to hand it off to Kalitha Williams, who is our project director of asset building. Thank you all. Kalitha?
Good morning, and thank you for participating today. I'm Kalitha Williams, and I lead the organization's asset building work. Asset building is an anti-poverty strategy that focuses on lifting families out of poverty by helping them save, protect, and accumulate assets. And when we talk about assets, we're talking about more than people owning homes and cars. It also includes making sure people have opportunities for education and training so that they can increase their wages and advance in their career. It includes having access to good health insurance so that families can be healthy and take care of each other. And it also includes having access to affordable and sound financial products like traditional banking and savings accounts. I'm going to share today some policy opportunities that'll protect Ohio's families during this health and economic recovery. One in particular is focused on auto insurance premiums. Because of the pandemic and the stay-at-home orders, many people haven't been on the road. And when there are fewer people driving, there are fewer accidents. Our auto insurance industry, many of whom have extended premium reductions and rebates to their customers, unfortunately, they are just way too small based on the limited amount of risk that insurance companies are facing because so few people are on the road and there are so few accidents. And this is an issue because Ohio drivers, like many drivers across different states, we are required to have auto insurance. Because of this crisis, with so few people on the road, auto insurance companies are reporting record profits. Second quarter earnings that were reported of recently found that Progressive Insurance, Ohio's largest auto insurance company, in the second quarter actually had their earnings of over $800 million than in the last second quarter earnings last year. Geico Auto Insurance Company, which is the second largest auto insurance company in the country, had a five-fold increase from their second quarter earnings last year, which were about $400 million. They reported recently a $2.1 billion earnings statement. So while the auto insurance companies are experiencing record profits, they should be passing on those savings to Ohio consumers. In this regard, we think it's important that legislation be passed to ensure that Ohio drivers are not being overcharged for their insurance policies. Another policy measure is around price gouging. Many of us saw reports around the country and maybe also in your local community at how the demand for different products just created an opportunity for unscrupulous stores and business owners to increase the prices of those products. And you see here, I have a picture of hand sanitizer. And I think that's just a great example of how many of us saw a product that became in huge demand during the health pandemic. Some people took advantage of that and increased the prices dramatically. Ohio could join 36 other states that have laws around price gouging that are triggered because of state emergencies for health, weather, or economic reasons. And model legislation would include the following provisions. It would limit hoarding. Many of us recall at the beginning of this health pandemic, it was very hard to find products, cleaning products, toilet paper. Limiting the amount of products that people can purchase can ensure that all of us can take care of our basic needs. We need to have clear criteria for price gouging. And that's important. Many people saw that over the course of a few weeks that the price of hand sanitizer went up hundreds of percent within a short period of time. States with strong price gouging laws have a specific trigger where if the price of a good increases 10 to 20% in 15 to 30 days, then it would alert the state attorney general to take action against that company. And the last provision includes regulating online markets. When people couldn't find items in stores, they turned to online marketplaces like Amazon and eBay. And unfortunately, many of their vendors and suppliers increased their prices. Amazon and eBay have contended that they cannot control their vendors, but other states have taken action and to ensure that their consumers are protected, not just from companies and stores in their state, but also from online marketplaces that serve their consumers as well. And the last area I want to cover is focus on predatory financial products. As Mike shared, there are lots of Ohio families that are unemployed and struggling financially. And unfortunately, there are industries that focus on targeting families that are struggling and trying every day to make ends meet. Many of us are familiar with payday lending, which are short-term, high-interest rate lending products that are primarily focused on people who have challenges getting a traditional loan. In Ohio, our average interest rate for a payday loan is about 140%. And research has shown that triple-digit interest rate loans that are due in short periods of time keep families in a cycle of debt. And what we really need is a 36% rate cap on all consumer loans in Ohio, so that when people need to access these loans, they're affordable and they can pay them back in a reasonable amount of time. We've already heard reports nationally of payday lenders targeting people in our state and nationally who are just trying to pay their bills. And this is an important area that deserves more protection. Many of you may have seen commercials in the middle of the night where a company will promise to help people settle their debt for pennies on the dollar. These are for-profit debt settlement companies that promise to help consumers settle their credit card or other unsecured debt for less than what they owe. Unfortunately, research has shown that they just do not deliver on their promises to reduce debt. In Ohio, we have a statute, the Ohio Debt Adjusters Act, that protects consumers from this industry charging excessive and exploitative fees. We know that this industry has pushed hard to challenge this act. And we know that as people are struggling to pay their bills, that this industry will become more aggressive at trying to reduce this consumer protection. It'll be more important than ever for us to uphold this statute. So again, as we are focused on protecting consumers through the Ohio recovery, it'll be more important than ever that we have policies that protect them. At this time, I'm going to introduce Amanda Woodrum. She is our senior researcher focusing on health disparities.
Thanks, Kalitha. I sort of describe my overall work as the intersection of health, equity, and the environment. But today I'll be focusing in on Ohio's health divide and barriers to health and how we overcome those barriers to health. But I also lead a project to reimagine Appalachia into a 21st century sustainable economy. You can go ahead and advance. So one thing that's important for you to know is that Ohio ranks in the bottom of the pack among states for the health and well-being of our residents, and that this is driven in large part between a health divide among rich and poor Ohioans, as well as Black, Hispanic, and white Ohioans. The truth is that low-income Ohioans are far more likely to be in fair or poor health than their wealthier counterparts. They're more likely to be depressed, have diabetes, and have multiple chronic conditions. You can go ahead and advance. The bottom line is poverty is bad for your health. It's stressful, and chronic poverty is toxic. Frequent or prolonged adversity from poverty creates toxic stress. Low-income people face stress more often for longer periods of time, and they have fewer resources or the coping skills to be able to deal with that stress. And that makes people sick. It creates toxic hormonal responses related to the fight or flight reaction. It also creates metabolic changes, and ultimately these physical impacts make folks more susceptible to disease and poor health generally. And we're seeing ultimately that play out in real time with COVID, because poor folks, as well as folks in the Black community in particular, are experiencing much more disastrous effects from COVID. For kids, this kind of toxic stress has lifelong impacts. It not only affects their physical well-being, but it affects them mentally. It affects their ability to focus and do well in school. And as we all know, success or lack of it in school can have lifelong career impacts. And for these kids, when they have kids, that takes us to a cycle of poverty and poor health. Next. So we sort of covered that poverty is bad for your health, but so is racism. And Black Americans generally are much more likely to die from heart disease than white Americans. Part of that story, in particular in Ohio, is Black Ohioans are 3 times as likely to live in poverty as white Ohioans. And this is a really important piece of the puzzle, but again, it's not the whole story. When you control, even when you control for income, Black Americans have higher death rates from heart disease. And this is true at every income level. And academic researchers attribute this to the fact that experiencing racism, whether it's overt or subtle, in people's everyday lives, whether it's at the grocery store or the doctor's office and job interviews, at the library, that stress is another addition to toxic stress levels, and that elevates blood pressure, leads to hypertension, and which of course we know is a leading cause of heart disease. Next. Adding insult to injury is what exacerbates the health divide, is that poor people, and particularly Black Ohioans, are more likely to live in areas, segregated areas of concentrated poverty. This is described in the academic literature somewhat arbitrarily, but the line at 40% of residents in an area or in a neighborhood, in the case of my research, I've defined it as a census tract, where 40% of the residents in that census tract live in poverty. So this is concentrated poverty, and that has implications for the community and the neighborhood. And these are neighborhoods where people feel more unsafe. They're more likely to be exposed to pollution or live in substandard housing conditions. There's less green space for recreation and exercise. There's less access to healthy foods. And in these neighborhoods often face transportation barriers, whether it's how to get to healthy food or to the doctor's office, to school or to work. And in turn, because the entire community or the entire neighborhood is, or portions of it are in poverty, the communities themselves have fewer resources to counteract these conditions or create health enhancing opportunities. So that means that there is a role for the state government to play here to drive investments into these areas of concentrated poverty. And that's true for the federal government as well. Next. You can find on our website, this work is around our health equity work, has a special project page on our website. And you can find this map here of areas of concentrated poverty throughout Ohio. It's done, as I said, by census tract. So you can click on it and find out, look at it for your district in particular. But on the whole, you'll notice, not surprisingly, that there's deeper red in our urban core. But many of you also might know or see that the Appalachian and the rural areas of Ohio also have the deeper red colors associated with them. Next. All right, so here's the good news. We can do better. Other states do better. And there's a role for public policy to play here. Ohio can be a state where people can live happy, healthy lives, whether they're white, Black, or brown, or rich or poor. And the bottom line is that states with less income inequality do better than their weaker policy neighbors. So we can do better. And of course, this means investments in anti-poverty programs that Wendy will be talking about its better tax system, that Zach will be talking about its work and wages, that Mike covered its asset building, that Kalitha covered. All of those things that we'll be talking about, or I've already talked about, also have impacts on the health of our citizens. And at the end of the day, the reason we grow the economy is to promote the health and well-being of our residents. And part of the problem we have now is that we don't fully understand the impacts that our public policy decisions have on health. We think a lot about how proposed legislation or proposed policy rule change impact businesses, and there's systems in place to think about these things. But if all we ever do is think about the business impact of the policy decisions that we make, we'll only ever make bad decisions. And so a key piece of this work is that we need to better understand the health implications of the laws that we're proposing and the policies we're changing. And there is a bill in the Ohio House that would accomplish this, sponsored by Columbus Representative Crawley, House Bill 620, that would require the Legislative Service Commission to consider the health impacts of proposed legislation. It would also require state agencies to consider the health impacts of the rules that they're proposing, and other sort of preliminary measures so that we can better understand this problem. So my hope is that you'll consider co-sponsoring this legislation and encourage others to do so as well. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Pete Van Leer to talk about criminal justice reform and the need for it.
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks, Amanda, and thank you all for taking the time to be here today. So on justice reform, Kalitha, you can go to the first slide. We work in coalition with a group brought together by the Ohio Transformation Fund, includes the ACLU of Ohio, Ohio Organizing Collaborative, and Ohio Justice and Policy Institute. You see here the principles we call the 5 R's. Overall, our goal is to reduce the prison population in Ohio so that resources can be spent to better meet Ohioans' basic needs, which is a lot of what Amanda was just talking about, others as well. So this would keep our communities safer and stronger for all Ohioans, no matter where they live, what they look like, right? So the first R is reclassification of minor drug possession from felony to misdemeanor. That would mean we would stop saddling Ohioans with felony convictions when what they really need is treatment. We know that incarcerating people struggling with addiction is a drain on resources, doesn't improve public safety, or give people the second chance that they need. Next R is retroactive application of that reclassification. This would help communities over-targeted by past drug enforcement. And this is important because the so-called war on drugs, as you probably know, disproportionately targeted African Americans in Ohio and around the country. So we need to reform the probation to prison pipeline system, because nearly a quarter of people entering Ohio's prison system, about 4,700 people per year, nearly a quarter are incarcerated for minor probation or parole violations, right? Not new crimes, but violations, what we call technical violations. Reducing sentences for incarcerated people who earn it by participating in programming in prison would help Ohioans come out of prison better able to work and re-enter society. And the last R is reemployment. We've done a lot of work about this. Mike in particular, when people with records are blocked from jobs, they struggle to support themselves. They have a harder time making their way, and it makes them more vulnerable to committing another crime. Next slide, Kalitha. Here's why reducing our state's prison population is so important. So we're experiencing in Ohio a crisis in our justice system. It's not a new thing, but the coronavirus pandemic has made it more apparent and more critical really than ever to address the injustice that's built into this system. The state's prisons are extremely overcrowded, due in large part to the war on drugs. We've seen a drop in the past several months, about 4,000, with the action taken by local jails and judges, as well as the governor, but it's not enough to right-size our prison system. We're still way over capacity. The COVID infection rate is 9 times higher in prison overall in Ohio, and the death rate nearly 6 times higher. So much of our work over the past several months of the pandemic has focused on the safe and responsible release of incarcerated people to protect them, prison staff, and the broader community. You know, the virus didn't start in prisons, but they really are petri dishes for the disease, and it can spread, you know, rapidly within the population. We've seen that really dramatically in Ohio. We have some of the highest among the highest death rates in prison systems in the country. But this also leads to a higher rate of community spread as it goes out through staff. And the fact is that too many people are in prison right now who don't need to be there. And there are a lot of ways to address this that we haven't really taken on in Ohio. That includes early release. There's been some of that, but alternatives to incarceration, at least on a temporary basis, to create the space and treatment capacity in prisons. Slide 3, next slide, please. So a couple of specific things we've been working on. Senate Bill 3 passed out of the Senate this summer and is now awaiting action in the House. And House Bill 1 was approved by the House last year, and it's now in the Senate. These are both bipartisan bills, and they're small steps that would move the justice reform process forward in Ohio. SB 3 would reclassify some low-level drug possession charges from felony to misdemeanor so that people struggling with addiction would receive treatment rather than incarceration. And it has some differences, you know, it would punish a person differently if they're found with a small amount of a controlled substance rather than larger amounts of the same thing. There are some exceptions in the bill that weaken it at this point. Most notably, it won't apply to people knowingly using fentanyl, which is really in a lot of street drugs today. It's very prevalent. The other thing is that the bill would not be retroactive. So while it would help moving forward and reclassify moving forward, it won't benefit people who've been impacted with felony convictions in the past. House Bill 1 focuses on intervention in lieu of conviction, so defendants can benefit from alternatives to prison. It requires courts to hold hearings when people are charged with crimes related to their drug and alcohol problems. If judges deny intervention in lieu of conviction, they would have to state on the record why they think it's not appropriate. So we see this increasing the likelihood that courts will choose treatment over conviction. And record sealing is included under both bills. And actually a recent analysis Amanda did connected to her work on the health divide shows that because these bills would decrease drug use, reduce prison populations, and reduce barriers to employment, housing, public assistance for people with felonies, they would really positively impact the health of Ohioans overall. There's a lot of work left to do. Some of the next steps include, I mentioned before, retroactivity. It's still missing from SB 3, and we really need to move that forward in the future so that people can overcome barriers imposed on their lives by their past felonies, even if they're out in their communities and having served time already. Our state really needs to tackle the bail system, and the inequitable impact of that's pretty clear. It puts people in jail when they can't afford to pay and increases the likelihood that they'll end up back in prison. That's what the research shows. A good thing is that the Ohio Criminal Sentencing Commission is working to create a felony sentencing database. This would help us really understand who's impacted, who's getting hit within the criminal justice system, and how we can change that. It makes information more accessible and reportable. Right now, it's very disjointed among all the county systems, the court systems, and there's no central database on that, and we need to work on that. Another important effort in the works is parole board reform, which could be a much needed step forward to really make the system more equitable and more fair for everybody. So these are just some of the next steps our state is moving toward to create a more equitable system. And now I will give you Wendy Patton, our Senior Project Director, who's going to talk to you about the state budget.
Thanks so much, Pete. And thank you to all of you who are attending. We're very grateful for the opportunity to talk with you today. Let's move to the first slide here. I'm going to talk about Ohio's operating budget, and I'm going to talk from a technical perspective. But the overall framework for the budget, of course, is values. It's a budget, your public finance, your services. It's a statement of priorities. So I'm going to go ahead and describe the budget as it is, but keep in mind that it reflects the priorities and values of the lawmakers who have made decisions about it. Ohio has 5 biennial budgets, the transportation budget, the capital budget, the Bureau of Workers' Compensation budget, Industrial Commission budget. But all we really care about mostly is the operating budget, the main operating budget. The 2020 operating budget has $24 billion in the state source general revenue fund, and we'll talk about what I mean by state source in a minute, and $70 billion in the all funds budget. Now we pay our greatest attention to the general revenue fund because that's where the flexible state taxpayer funds made up primarily of sales and personal income tax, that's where they live. The all funds budget includes federal funds, which make up more than 1/3 of our budget, dedicated purpose funds for special purposes, fiduciary funds like the local sales tax that just passed through the state. So that's why there's a big difference between what the state takes in taxpayer funds and the all funds budget, which is much bigger. In state fiscal year 2020, the budget has already been cut because of the pandemic. It was cut by $776 million. In state fiscal year 2021, the current year, we are facing a $2.4 billion revenue shortfall. Next slide, please. This pie chart shows you how the composition of the general revenue fund. And it's a visual kind of a thing. I just want you to see that those pie slices in blue represent education. The darker one is our K through 12 schools. The lighter one is higher education. Those in green represent health and human services. Medicaid is in the darker pie slice, and other health and human services in the lighter. Corrections makes up about 9% of the budget. Local government about 3%. And the rest is all about 9% of the budget. So in terms of our state source funds, education is the biggest expense, with health and human services making up about 1/4. And Cleve, if you'll click it, we'll fly in what the general revenue fund looks like when you include the federal funds that Ohio chooses to place in our general revenue fund. A handful of states do this. They plop a little bit, not a little bit, a big chunk of federal funds down in the general revenue fund. It is thought that this may have had to do when they first started doing this in the 1990s with keep making sure that the general revenue fund, to which the state debt cap is linked, big enough to allowing the capital budget to be big enough to cover Ohio's needs. But what you see is that new black pie slice, which represents federal Medicaid dollars, which are placed in Ohio's general revenue fund, make up by themselves 23%. So when you look at the general revenue fund from this perspective, including the federal funds that Ohio chooses to place in it, suddenly health and human services become half of the state budget. Both ways of looking at it are correct. We look at it, we analyze how legislators use state source funds. Next slide, please. Here, once again, the first slide that you'll see here represents use of funds in the state general revenue fund over the last 16 years, back to 2005. What you see is that state expenditures on an inflation-adjusted basis have declined. The state expenditures, state source GRF expenditures have declined from 4.9% of the gross domestic product of the state to 3.5%. There have been a lot of tax cuts that have taken about $6 billion out of the system on an inflation-adjusted basis since 2005. So state source spending has fallen. Although you can see it's fallen pretty evenly across sectors that are funded. Khalif, if you'll click it, we'll fly in the other slide that shows the Medicaid component of the budget. Here you see the general revenue fund has risen slightly, but that has risen with the Medicaid expansion. When you include the federal Medicaid dollars, in which the state for several years did put the dollars from the Medicaid expansion in the general revenue fund, you see it drives the health and human service expenditures up slightly. A fact that is worth keeping in mind is that Medicaid expansion is picked up by 90 cents on every dollar of the Medicaid expansion is picked up by the federal government. It supports 54,000 jobs in the Ohio economy. Next slide, please. Now, education is really, K through 12 education is the biggest single expenditure in the state budget, and it's the most important expenditure, arguably, in the state budget. This slide shows expenditure per pupil over time, and it's adjusted for inflation. And you could see the ups and the downs where there would be an impulse, a legislative impulse during the Strickland era to expand educational funding. There were big cuts during the Kasich era. Over time, it's been flat. Now you'll see in the most recent year, the chart reflects an influx of CARE Act monies, which are, we'll get to them. They're a little bit hard for, the distribution is different than the foundation funding. Some districts will use them easily, others won't. But I guess the takeaway here is that Ohio's funding has been pretty flat, although there's been sort of a roller coaster for the last 16 years. This doesn't mean that needs have been constant. We found that over 15 years, adjusted for inflation, the expenditures on education have declined by 2% per student. And what we need is more money in the system, not less. In 1997, the great majority of Ohio school districts joined in a lawsuit, the DeRolf case. The Supreme Court found that state funding of schools was unconstitutional because it did not provide an equal quality of education as mandated in the Constitution. And this was because of reliance on local property taxes. Plants had closed, the state was getting poorer in many places, but not evenly. Some places were getting richer. Many districts were struggling while others were getting richer. The state funding formula, given the constitutional provision, was to equalize that, but it didn't. The problem was never fixed. Appeals finally ceased over the next 10 years. The Supreme Court sort of threw up its hands. The formula has changed many times. You see that in the roll of this sort of roller coaster graph, but it's not been fixed. A bipartisan bill that you'll hear about this fall, the Cupp-Patterson bill, does introduce a new funding formula, and it has broad bipartisan support throughout the Ohio legislature. And we'll keep an eye and see how it does. Something to keep in mind in thinking about the funding of public schools is that hundreds of millions of K through 12 dollars are spent on private schools, a separate system. Started as a pilot program approved by the Supreme Court in 2002, the privatization of schools has grown into a major drain on public school funding. When you consider all voucher programs, 513 school districts are losing an estimated $333 million going into 2021. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, this chart shows, this is a rather complex chart, and I included, it's from the Ohio Education Policy Institute, which is a fantastic source of data on educational funding. I wanted you to see in this chart how local resources have grown unevenly or even have fallen while state resources have not evenly compensated. This chart divides school districts into quintiles by income. The bars on the far left of this chart show the state averages. When you look at the red bars, you see the lowest income quintile of districts, the local resources they were able to contribute to education between 2000 and 2018 actually declined. It stagnated at the next two levels, and then it grew strongly as you get to your highest earning quartiles. That's the red bars. The blue bars show how state aid changed over time. It grew strongly at the lower level, but it also grew across all quintiles. And in the end, you see growth, strong growth across almost all quintiles. Let's fly in the final chart, Kalitha, with a click. This chart shows that by 2018, equalization had not really happened, although funding had been kept level and there was some redistribution of funds. The funding on average of the districts by quintile, you still see unequal funding in the bottom three quintiles of school districts. The problem is one of falling property values in low-income communities. It's also one that has to do with the cost of educating children in poverty. The cost of educating economically disadvantaged children is estimated to be between 25% to 150% higher than the cost of educating a, quote, typical child. This is what the legislators are considering in the Cupp-Patterson bill, and it's an important topic that you will hear about on the campaign trail. Next slide, please. Higher education has been flatlined in the budget as well. You will see that in 2018, there were 472,000 students enrolled in Ohio's public institutions of higher education. Enrollment has fallen since 2010, when there were nearly 500,000 enrolled. Enrollment of Black students has fallen especially fast, from 13% of the student population, which is representational, to 11% today. Today, Ohio spends 17% less per student than before the recession. The cost of the tuition is high, 35th highest in the nation, according to the College Board, which makes it particularly hard for students of low and middle income to go to school. Next slide, please. This slide simply gives you a visual representation of how funding for need-based student aid through the Ohio College Opportunity Fund fell sharply after the recession of 2008 and has never been restored. Now, the legislature has a goal of attaining a more educated population with 65% with a degree or credential, but without providing easier, more affordable access and financial aid for older, non-white, part-time, low-income, first-generation students. It's going to be hard to get from here to there with both state funding for classroom instruction flatlined and need-based financial aid cut deeply. Next slide, please. The other big area of funding within the state budget is health and human services. We'll start with Medicaid because it's a big program, and I've given you some numbers up here as to why Medicaid matters so much in Ohio. If you'll recall back to Mike Shields' chart on the low-wage jobs in Ohio, many of Ohio's largest job groups leave a small family eligible for and in need of Medicaid health insurance at the median wage. That's why a little over a quarter of all Ohioans are receive their health care through Medicaid. They're insured by Medicaid. More than half the births in Ohio are paid for by Medicaid. It pays for almost 2/3 of nursing home care. It is the biggest payer of health insurance costs of any insurer in the state. Next slide, please. We'll go on to the next. Yes, thank you. This chart simply shows who is eligible for Medicaid and what income levels are eligible. Medicaid covers children, pregnant women, parents, childless adults, disabled workers who buy into the program, and disabled people. you'll see that the level for childless adults, parents, and disabled people is 138% of the federal poverty line. That's about between 15 and 17,000 for an individual, maybe 27,000 a year for a parent with 2 children. It's children are covered under the Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP, in families that earn no more than 205% of the federal poverty level. For a family of 3, that's about 42,000 a year. Disabled workers can buy in if their income is no more than 250% of the federal poverty level. The green bars at the top represent the federal marketplace formed under the Affordable Care Act, and there people earning up to 400% of the federal poverty level can get subsidy for their health. They help cut the cost of health insurance. But the Medicaid population and who is covered is represented by the blue bars. Next slide, please. State source funding for health and human services over time has actually declined, although poverty rates have risen. This shows that we've cut overall spending on health and human services by 15%, a loss of about $850 million over the past 15 years. The problem that we're left with, as the governor himself has pointed out in recent comments about our public health department, is that the long-term underfunding of social services leaves us in a bad spot when we have a crisis like a pandemic and a recession. The state cuts to health and human services have been compounded by cuts to local government, because local governments fund an important component of health and human services in Ohio. Next slide, please. Ohio's got a bad track record by now in terms of recovering from recessions, and that's because we cut aid way too fast after the last recession of 2008. This slide is an example of one of the ways in which cuts can hurt people. It shows the enrollment in Ohio's cash assistance program called Ohio Works First. And you see a sharp drop in enrollment in Ohio Works First, while the black line at the top of the chart represents the poverty rate. While poverty rate remains very high, twice as high as in 2006, we've dramatically cut our cash assistance program, which leaves families struggling more than they should struggle. The state has built up hundreds of millions of dollars in the TANF surplus funds instead of spending them on struggling families. Next slide, please. And here's where we look at how the cuts to local governments actually impact health and human services. Between 2006 and the current time, the state funding of local governments dropped by more than $1 billion on an inflation-adjusted basis through elimination of tax reimbursements for big property taxes eliminated earlier in in about 2005, through the cutting in half of state revenue sharing and the elimination of several local tax sources. What people don't, I think, commonly recognize is that it's local property tax levies that play an instrumental role in key health and human services, including child welfare, domestic violence services, developmental disability services, mental health services. Your local property tax levies are critical to these services, and local and human services are delivered locally in Ohio. So the cuts to local governments have impacted and greatly reduced human services in a way that's almost been invisible to most Ohioans. So we've seen disinvestment in Ohio, and in this recession, as we face a big budget deficit, as we face budget cuts, there's a better way forward than we took after the last recession. It's time to rebuild, and I'm going to pass this over to Zach Schiller to give us ideas on how we can rebuild.
Well, thanks, Wendy, and glad to be wrapping this up for you. I'm Zach Schiller. I'm research director, and I spent a lot of my time looking at Ohio tax policy. Next slide, please. So as most of you probably know, the hallmark of Ohio tax policy over the past 15 years has been tax cuts. We've cut our income tax by a third. We eliminated our estate tax. We got rid of a couple of big business taxes, replaced them with one which only brings in half as much revenue. We've created a giant new, what we call the LLC loophole, a business income deduction for owners of certain businesses. Altogether, as Wendy mentioned, this has reduced revenue to the state by $6 billion a year. This graph, or these two graphs, show you what some of the impacts of this have been. On the one hand, Ohio jobs have grown at only a fraction of that of the nation as a whole. This was prior to the pandemic. If we went to today, this would show the bars being negative, but we would still be looking a lot worse than the country as a whole. So the tax cut policy has not delivered in giving us more jobs. At the same time, who has benefited and who hasn't? Well, the graph on the right shows you that the bottom 20% of Ohioans who make less than $13,000 a year on average got a tax increase of about $140. People in the middle, basically it was a wash. And for the top 1%, these are people who make over $500,000 a year, average 1.3 million. They got a $40,000 a year tax cut on average. Let me repeat that. They got a $40,000 a year tax cut. So this shows you who benefited and who didn't from the tax changes that we've seen in the last 15 years. Next slide, please. This graph shows you, it breaks the tax-paying population into fifths, except for the graphs on the right where we get into a little more detail. But this shows you as a share of income, how much are Ohioans paying in state and local taxes altogether. So the graph on the left, the bar shows you that the bottom 20% paid 12.3% of their income in state and local taxes, and almost invisible there is the blue bar at the bottom, which represents the state personal income tax. And as you can see, that tax is the only tax that really hits people with higher income to a greater degree, but it only partly offsets the extent to which our tax system is upside down, in which the highest income people, the people on the right here, top 1%, which is the bar at the extreme right, are paying only a little over half as much in state and local taxes as those at the bottom. People in the middle are paying 10.7. So you can see how important the personal income tax is here, but it is not sufficient in allowing our tax system to be even fair to the degree of people paying the same amount as a share of taxes. Next slide, please. So one of the other major things which we spend a lot of our time on, Wendy and I, is taking a look at all the exemptions, credits, and deductions that exist in the state tax code. And this year they'll amount to almost $10 billion a year, which is, since you can see from Wendy's presentation, our general revenue fund is about 25 billion. That's a pretty sizable amount of money. Or as a one-time landlord of mine said, that's a pretty hefty chunk of coin. What are all of these tax breaks? Well, we won't go into detail here, but one of the biggest is the one I mentioned earlier, the $1 billion that goes to business owners for the LLC loophole, but it includes others ranging from one for data centers to people who buy timeshares in jet aircraft. Some of them are things that we really need, but many aren't, and it doesn't get the kind of review that it should. The graph on the left shows you that altogether, these tax exemptions, credits, and deductions actually add up to a bit more than what we spend on K-12 education. Next slide, please. So what can we do about all of this? Well, first off, we ought to slash the business income deduction. This has not resulted in any significant increase in the number of small businesses in Ohio, which is what it was supposed to promote, in employment, new employment by those businesses, and at the same time, it's draining over $1 billion in revenue. The House actually passed a major reduction in that last year, but it didn't get all the way through the full budget process. We need to increase top income tax rates on the most affluent Ohioans. As you saw, they're getting a $40,000 a year tax cut on average. We could raise our tax levels back up to where they were at one time on the most affluent and generate considerable revenue, and they still would be doing better, especially also when you remember that they've also benefited from gigantic federal tax cuts. Ohio also is one of only 6 states in the country that has no tax on corporate profits. We need to remedy that, particularly now, as you can see, some companies that are doing especially well during the pandemic. And that is something that we'll be exploring in a future report. Finally, we need to make the earned income tax credit refundable. We have in Ohio a state earned income tax credit like they do at the federal level, which helps working families, but it doesn't allow them, it's only amounts to how much they pay in state income taxes. And so that means that many of the poorest Ohioans do not benefit at all from it. And as you can see, they're paying a much larger share of their income in state and local taxes. So we need to make that refundable. And that again would go some ways to making our tax code a little bit more, not only just, but it would make it a little less upside down. We have a number of reports on all of these things, and we invite you to learn more about it or ask more about us about it in future. I'm going to turn it back over to Hannah now, and she can wrap things up.
All right, everybody, thanks for hanging with us through our sort of lecture component of the webinar today. Again, drop your questions here in the chat and we will ask them. I wanted to just reassure folks, we will be sending out the recorded portion of the presentation. We'll get those slides out to you. We'll include some links to some of our larger reports if you want to do a little bit of a deeper dive. And then we're available for even deeper discussions on the matters that we work on. So you will be hearing from us, and we encourage you to reach out to us as you work through those materials, as you run into policy questions, like we're here as a resource. So one of the questions that came through during the presentations was about the payday lending discussion. And Kalitha, was there, folks seem to remember that there was a bill passed that did something for payday lending, but maybe it didn't do enough. Can you let us in on what happened and what the state of play is on that question?
Sure, thank you. So in 2018, the legislature passed legislation to try to rein in the industry. And it did do a couple of important things. It closed the credit service organization loophole, which many payday lenders were using to charge excessive interest rates. At that time, Ohio had some of the highest interest rates for payday lending in the country. I saw some loans at 688%. So it did remove that loophole, which in turn significantly reduced the interest rate. The Ohio Department of Commerce released a report, and the average interest rate that they're reporting for the industry is about a little over 140%, which obviously is a huge difference from 688%. Unfortunately, because the interest rate is still triple digit, it has, and research has shown that it keeps consumers in debt for the majority of the year. So these are short-term loans, but if you didn't have $300, you're not likely to have an additional $300 when the term of your loan is due. So people refinance those loans and find themselves in debt for the majority of the year. Another important thing the legislation did was close auto title lending stores. I don't know if you've noticed, all over the state, these stores have shut down, they're closed, they're collecting dust. So the legislation did do some important things, but because it still allows this over 100% interest rate, it just does not go far enough. And just quickly, I want to note that there are about 14 states in the country that don't even allow payday lending. And the bill that passed was based on legislation in Colorado, And Colorado in 2018 had a ballot initiative that passed in their state to institute a 36% interest rate on all consumer loans. And I just think it's important that Ohio move in that direction as well.
All right, thanks, Kalitha. We have a comment and question about the CAT tax and local government funding. So the CAT tax was enacted initially to replace the revenue from the tangible personal property tax, which was all local government revenue. Isn't most of the CAT tax revenue now going into the state GRF, thus further starving local governments for revenue? I feel like that's both a Zach and a Wendy question and a very policy matters. You're asking the right folks on that.